Welcome. Let's talk about urban planning. And let's talk about strategies to convert empty office buildings into housing in Istanbul. In this city in particular, the pandemic caused a surge in empty office spaces, especially in its expensive city center, while there was and there is a lack of affordable housing in the area. My guest Zeynep Aydemir will tell us about a project where architecture students redesigned a vacant high-rise, the Tat Towers, into housing. This will help us understand how projects of this nature can address housing shortages and provide learning experience for students in sustainable design. Rodrigo Silva, as always, let's talk about urban planning. Zeynep, welcome to our episode.
Thank you for inviting me.
There is a high vacancy rate in office buildings globally, particularly in expensive city centers, while at the same time, there's a lack of affordable housing in those same areas. And the situation is projected to worsen if left unaddressed. And so your study looks into a potential good solution for the problem, right?
Yes. Well, in our design studio, we started looking at the adaptive reuse of high-rise buildings for housing in Istanbul Central Business District. This idea really took shape when we noticed a big shift to remote work, especially after the COVID-19 pandemic. And plus, there are quite a few high-rise buildings in Istanbul that have never been occupied since they were built. We call them ghost buildings, actually. So these buildings have higher rents and operational costs, which is why many of them are vacant. But here's the interesting part, that they have a lot of potential for being converted from official to residential spaces. They're in the city center, they have great infrastructure, and they're built to withstand earthquakes. So on top of that, Istanbul is also dealing with a pretty serious housing crisis due to a combination of economic issues, a rising number of migrants, and the extreme earthquake risk. So we thought this situation presented a good research opportunity for architecture students to tackle these real-world problems in the design studio.
And what are the highlights of this project? So what would you pinpoint?
Okay, so our study turned up some really interesting insights about the area's development. First of all, historically, the area, this part of Istanbul, stayed pretty rural until the 1950s. And it was originally meant to be a military buffer zone to protect the city's northern forests and water basins. But then in the 1950s, things started to shift with affordable housing projects in the area and the growth of the automotive, pharmaceutical, and textile industries. And this boom brought a lot of internal migration in the 1980s. So what started as an industrial zone has now become a mix of legalized scattered neighborhoods, gated communities, shopping malls, and high-rises in the central business district. So our students focused on the adaptive reuse of two specific vacant buildings, but they also looked into broader planning problems in the area. It's interesting because studying energy crisis, high-rise buildings, and extreme conditions in architectural studios often gets overlooked. So we realized there is a big need for adaptable spaces that support communal or co-living arrangements. And these spaces should be designed to optimize resources and energy use, and they need to handle extreme conditions. So there were some cool ideas from our students. Some of them are they offered structural improvements for the Tat Towers, the tower we focused on. And they offered blurring the lines between residential and office spaces to create mixed-use, adaptable areas and short-term housing solutions like dorms and shelters. They also offered improving pedestrian access and public social program by promoting walkability and better public accessibility. Also, they offered developing systems to optimize energy use and generate new energy. And finally, they offered incorporating production and recycling systems into future living scenarios. So these were the main findings of the study.
Perfect. And following up on that might be a little bit of an obvious question, but who can learn from the results of this project? So who can learn from this outcome? And what are the lessons that you think are suitable to pass to other stakeholders?
Well, we work with students, but one of the big takeaways from our study is that we need a broader conversation. to tackle these challenges. It's really, really important to integrate these findings with diverse academic courses and come up with comprehensive recommendations. And also today, both research and practical applications in design are evolving rapidly, and lines are blurring. So our findings could influence public policies by encouraging more adaptive reuse of buildings, for example, which can help address housing shortages and optimize resource use. And institutions and organizations can use these insights to rethink urban planning and development strategies, focusing more on mixed-use spaces and energy efficiency. And also companies could benefit by exploring new business opportunities in the adaptive reuse market, and individuals might be more open to living in adaptable and energy efficient spaces. So overall, our study highlights the need for a collaborative approach to urban planning and design, which we can consider as both current challenges and our future needs.
I read your article and you indicate a potential gap in this project, which, well, you'll tell me if not a potential venue for future research. So that must be done more research on a specific interior design standards for these converted spaces. And you were mentioning this, which I think was important, the potential renewable energy generation, waste management systems in project like this. So tell us more about where should future research go?
Well, our article really highlights the potential for converting high-rise vacant office buildings in Istanbul, but because of the limited time frame of the studio, our findings were somehow broad. So for future research, there are plenty of opportunities, for example, more in-depth and targeted studies on design solutions for interior standards, for example, essential to pinpoint specific internal space standards or to better understand the practicalities of these conversions. So there's so much more to explore, and especially when it comes to the details of how these spaces can be adapted and optimized for residential use. So while we scratch the surface, there's a lot more to uncover, and we hope our work paves the way for those more detailed studies in the future.
Perfect. And you mentioned before some lessons for companies that were for working companies. So the study focused on a design studio project with students. So how do you think this, before I know your reflections, I will use my privilege as moderator. So how do you think the findings might differ if conducted by professional architects with real world constraints like budget or timelines? So could this be different?
As I mentioned, because of the limited time frame and our teaching goals, we couldn't look as deeply into designing housing units or experimenting with materials. Mm-hmm. So if professional architects were involved, I think they could explore these areas more thoroughly and have detailed discussions on new forms of housing and space standards when converting office spaces into residential use. Mm-hmm. And additionally, professionals would likely bring a practical perspective on budget and timeline, which would influence the feasibility of certain design choices. They would also consider the regulatory environment, local building codes, and stakeholder needs more closely. So real-world projects might require more collaboration with engineers, developers, and city planners, adding layers of complexity and practicality that we didn't fully address in the studio setting.
Of course, perfect. And well, I'm curious to know your personal reflections about this project. So Zeynep, how do you personally see the project, the end result, and the lessons for the future? So what are your thoughts on this?
Well, what was interesting for me is how adaptive reuse is becoming such a hot topic in architectural education, especially with the growing discussions around limiting new constructions or even stopping them altogether. So our main goal was for students to create research-driven design projects that integrate complex architectural programs within our urban context. Also, they were asked using advanced technologies and representation. So working on speculative and adaptive reuse scenarios in Istanbul's central business district gave them a unique real-world context to apply their skills, first of all. And one thing that really stood out was how repurposing spaces with historical value into new unique landmarks encouraged them to prioritize environmental considerations. So it wasn't just about lower costs or faster construction times. And it marks a bold step away from traditional aesthetics or conventional approaches. And it was highlighting a commitment to experimentation, innovation, and originality in their design approach. So I think this experience raised new questions like how can we further push the boundaries of adaptive reuse? What other unconventional spaces can we reimagine? And it's clear that there's so much potential for innovative and sustainable design solutions that we're just beginning to explore.
Mm-hmm. Perfect. Well, these final reflections would be amazing punchlines actually for this episode. But I will nevertheless try to close this episode the same way I do with all our speakers. So in no more than 2 sentences, if there was anything you want our audience to remember about this talk, what would it be?
Well, we aim to transform Istanbul's ghost towers into vibrant, inclusive communities through adaptive reuse. And our goal was to use adaptive reuse as a learning tool to inspire explorative and speculative design approaches in architectural education. I think these would be the 2 sentences I could summarize our work.
And I think they're very good. Zeynep, thank you very much.
You're welcome. Thank you for inviting us.
This podcast is powered by Cogitatu Press. You can listen to this episode on the Let's Talk About Urban Planning website, on Cogitatu Press YouTube channel, and whatever you get your podcast.